There are places in America where time moves differently, where old grudges linger in the air, and where the weight of the past never quite lifts. Stillwater, a small, forgotten town nestled deep in the Appalachian Hills, was one of those places. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least thought they did. But one man had always stood apart, wrapped in the shadows of rumor and superstition: Isaac Crow. Isaac had lived in the crooked, sagging house at the edge of town for as long as anyone could remember. His property, overgrown with thistles and twisted trees, seemed almost to shun the world around it. His windows, perpetually dark, watched the town like hollow eyes, and it was whispered among the townsfolk that no one had ever seen him smile. No one had ever seen him with company. He was a relic of a darker time, someone whose very presence seemed to drain the warmth from a room, a street, an entire town. The children of Stillwater had a game. They would dare one another to run up to his porch, knock on the door, and flee before he answered. But no one ever stayed long enough to hear the old man shuffle to the door. The stories kept them away, the stories about how people who ventured too close to Isaac's property at night would hear strange whispers in the wind, words they couldn't understand but that clawed at their minds long after they'd run away. Isaac Crow never shopped at the local store, never spoke to the sheriff, never even went to church. For decades he was just there, like a dark stain on the fabric of the town, an unpleasant but unavoidable fixture. When Isaac died, there was a palpable relief that swept through Stillwater. It wasn't that anyone hated him, exactly, it was more like his absence lifted a weight off everyone's chest, a shadow that had loomed over their lives for so long they hadn't realized it was there until it was gone. He was found slumped in a tattered armchair, his head tilted back, eyes open but empty. No one knew for certain how long he'd been dead before they found him. There had been no odor, no signs of decay, the kind of thing you'd expect from a man who'd been dead for days. But Isaac Crow had never been predictable in life, so why should his death be any different? The funeral was a quiet affair. The townspeople came, but not out of respect, more out of curiosity. No one shed a tear. No one whispered kind words or condolences. His casket was closed and the service was brief. When the preacher finished, there was a collective exhale, like the town had finally shaken off something dark, something long overdue. Stillwater, they all believed, could now breathe again. But that night something felt off. As dusk settled over the town, a strange unease rippled through the air. The wind, normally a soft whisper through the trees, picked up into an unsettling howl, rattling the windows of the houses. Dogs barked in frantic tones, only to fall silent as if they'd been scolded. And for the first time in years, people found themselves thinking about Isaac Crow again. It wasn't the good kind of forgetting that followed death, where you let the person fade into the distance of your mind. No. Isaac clung to the edges of their thoughts, like a dark spot in their periphery that they couldn't quite shake. The night air felt wrong, thicker somehow, like it carried more than just the usual damp chill of the mountains. At midnight, the clock tower in the town square chimed, and with each strike, a strange sensation crept into the bones of the townspeople. Most of them had retired to their beds early, wanting to forget the day, but sleep came hard. And when it did, it was troubled, filled with vague nightmares, shadowy figures, and whispers that seemed to slither into their minds. The first to notice something truly strange was old Mrs. Cunningham, who lived closest to Isaac's property. She swore the ground had moved, shifted in a way that wasn't right. "The earth's unsettled," she told her daughter on the phone the next morning. "I swear it's as if the grave didn't take to him." By noon, word had spread. Isaac's freshly dug grave was not sitting still. Something was moving underneath. The day after Isaac Crow's burial, a strange quiet had settled over Stillwater. It wasn't the peaceful kind that came with a gentle breeze and the rustle of leaves. It was the thick, oppressive kind, like the air was holding its breath. People moved about their daily routines, but there was a sense that something wasn't quite right. The way shadows seemed just a little too long, the way birds flew in tight, uneasy circles above the cemetery, refusing to land. By late afternoon, the wind picked up again, swirling dust down the cracked pavement of Stillwater's main street. It seemed to pull everyone's attention toward the cemetery, tugging at their curiosity as if someone, was calling. By dusk, small groups of townsfolk began drifting toward the iron gates of the graveyard, murmuring to one another about old Mrs. Cunningham's strange claims, about the nightmarish dreams so many of them had endured. No one wanted to say it aloud, but they all felt it, that heavy, twisting feeling deep in their gut. Something was wrong. The cemetery itself was an old one, with tombstones leaning precariously, some half swallowed by ivy. Most of the headstones bore names no one in town could remember, save for a few families that had been around long enough to trace their lineage back to the Civil War. Isaac's grave was among the newer ones, a fresh patch of dirt standing out in the sea of faded stone. But something had changed since the day before. A sparrow stood atop the earth of Isaac Crow's grave. It was small and delicate, its feathers ruffled in the cold wind that had begun to whip through the gravestones. The bird wasn't sitting or perched, it was standing, completely still, its tiny head pointed straight ahead, like a sentinel guarding something unseen. The sight of it made the townsfolk pause. They had gathered around the edges of the cemetery, hesitant to step closer but unable to turn away. "Odd, ain't it?" muttered Dale Harris, a gruff, middle-aged farmer who'd been one of the first to arrive. His voice sounded too loud in the heavy silence. "It's just a bird," scoffed Tom Weller, the local mechanic, though his voice wavered with uncertainty. But it wasn't just the bird. The earth beneath the sparrow where Isaac had been laid to rest didn't look right. The fresh soil had sunk in, deeper than it should have in a single day. The ground looked unsettled, uneven. Without warning, the sparrow twitched, its head jerking to the side in a sharp, unnatural motion. The townspeople stiffened, their breath catching in their throats. The bird twitched again, its body spasming once, twice. Then, in a horrible, deliberate motion, its beak opened wide, wider than should have been possible, the tiny bones of its skull cracking audibly in the still air. A low murmur spread through the crowd, but no one moved. No one could. As they watched, the bird's beak continued to stretch, its entire body distorting, limbs splaying out unnaturally. Then, with a sickening, wet sound, the sparrow's tiny chest began to split open, feathers parting as a thick, black substance oozed out. The liquid was not blood, it was darker, slicker, almost like oil, and it spilled onto the disturbed earth below, staining it as it pooled around the bird's feet. Gasps echoed through the crowd, but before anyone could comprehend what they were seeing, the sparrow's body gave one final shudder and tore open completely, collapsing in a mass of twisted feathers and bone. From the gaping wound in its chest, something began to emerge. It was slow at first, a glistening hand coated in the same black viscous substance, pushing up through the broken remains of the bird. Then another hand followed, gripping the edges of the sparrow's remains as though pulling itself up from a dark, suffocating place. The black oil clung to the figure as it rose, long ribbons of it stretching from the mass, glistening in the fading light. The crowd stood frozen, paralyzed by the unfolding horror. Someone whispered a prayer under their breath. Others simply stared, their minds struggling to grasp what was happening before their eyes. As the thing, no he, emerged from the ruins of the sparrow, the crowd collectively took a step back, but no one could tear their gaze away. There, covered in slick black oil that gleamed in the dying light, was Isaac Crow. But this wasn't the Isaac they had known, the hunched, frail old man they had buried just yesterday. This Isaac was twisted, unnaturally elongated. His face was a ghastly mask of pale, slack skin, smeared with the same dark fluid that dripped from his soaked clothes. White ribbons clung to his body, trailing from his limbs like shreds of a burial shroud, clashing against the black oil that coated him. Isaac stood there, chest heaving like he had just clawed his way up from the deepest grave imaginable. His eyes, those hollow, lifeless eyes, were wide open, but they didn't seem to focus on anything. He didn't look at the crowd that now stood in stunned, horrified silence. He didn't acknowledge the world around him at all. He simply stood there, swaying slightly, like a puppet whose strings had just been cut. Then, slowly, unnervingly, he took his first step forward. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as Isaac's foot sank into the earth, dragging behind him as though the ground was reluctant to let him go. He walked with a broken, lurching gait, his limbs moving as if they'd forgotten how to function. The wet squelch of the black oil dripping from his body echoed loudly in the cemetery, mingling with the growing whispers of the wind that seemed to come from nowhere. "He's not real," Tom Weller whispered, his voice barely audible over the thundering of his heart. This can't be real." But it was. Isaac Crow, dead and buried, was walking. The oil that coated his body left dark streaks on the ground as he moved, his bare feet slipping and sliding over the dirt, but he didn't stop. He didn't pause to gather himself or acknowledge the stunned faces of those who had gathered to witness this impossible event. His head turned slightly as though he were listening to something only he could hear. His path, however, was aimless. Isaac wandered through the gravestones, brushing past them, his fingers grazing the cold stone as if searching for something. The white ribbons hanging from his body fluttered in the wind, but no one could mistake the strange, unnatural stiffness in his movements. Every step was agony to watch. His joints cracked with every motion, the sound cutting through the heavy silence. His body trembled as though the very act of walking was a strain, but he never stopped moving. His breathing was shallow, rapid, like a man who had just clawed his way out of something far worse than death. And then he turned toward them. His eyes locked onto the crowd for the first time, and in that moment, the sense of foreboding that had hung over Stillwater since Isaac's death crystallized into sheer terror. His eyes, still clouded and vacant, seemed to look through them, not at them. There was no recognition in his expression, no hint of the man who had once shuffled through the streets of their town. And then he spoke. At first it was a garbled, choked sound, more like a cough than actual words. The black oil bubbled from his mouth as he tried again, his lips cracking open as he forced out a single, unintelligible word. The sound was guttural, like something that hadn't used its voice in years, or centuries. I-S-S-E. His voice trailed off into a wet, rattling breath as more of the black substance oozed from his mouth. The crowd stood paralyzed, the horror sinking in deeper with each passing second. Then, without warning, Isaac stopped moving. His body jerked violently, his limbs twitching as though some invisible force had taken hold of him. His eyes rolled back in his head and he let out a long, low moan, an inhuman sound that sent a wave of nausea through the crowd. That's when the first scream tore through the air. It was Mrs. Cunningham, the one who had warned them about the grave. She shrieked, stumbling backward, clutching at her chest as though her heart might give out from sheer terror. The sound of her fear broke the spell that had held the crowd in place. People began to back away, whispering frantic prayers under their breath, their eyes wide with disbelief and dread. But Isaac wasn't finished. As if summoned by some unseen command, his body began to move again, this time faster, more erratic. His limbs jerked violently as though they were being yanked by strings, the black oil spraying from his fingertips with every twitch. He stumbled forward, his body pitching toward the crowd, and they recoiled in terror, the realization dawning that this wasn't just some grotesque spectacle. Isaac was coming for them. The ribbons of white clung to his slick body, fluttering in the wind like grotesque streamers, marking him as something neither living nor dead. The air around him seemed to pulse with a wrongness, a sickening energy that made the ground tremble beneath their feet. The closer he got, the worse the feeling grew, like a heavy pressure building inside their skulls. "Run," someone whispered, their voice trembling with fear. But no one ran. They were too transfixed by the sight of Isaac Crow, oil-soaked, broken, and alive, stumbling toward them, his mouth still gaping open, the black sludge pouring from his lips like bile. His moans grew louder, more frantic, filling the air with an oppressive weight. It was as if the earth itself had turned against them, the very ground they stood on no longer safe. Then, just as Isaac was mere feet from the crowd, he stopped. His head jerked up, his body trembling as if caught in some violent, unseen current. For a moment, it seemed as though he might collapse, that whatever force had reanimated him would finally release its hold. But Isaac didn't fall. Instead, he let out one final, choked moan before his body split open. The black oil surged out of him in a flood, spraying the ground, the gravestones, and even the crowd. People screamed, stumbling back as the viscous substance splattered their clothes, their skin. The smell of it was overwhelming, like rot and death, suffocating in its intensity. Isaac's body crumpled to the ground in a heap of slick, black ruin, the white ribbons soaked in the dark liquid. For a long, agonizing moment, no one moved. No one breathed. And then the earth beneath them began to tremble. The graves, all the graves were shifting.